The tragedy of Richard Gere is that the world gave him everything and then took it all away, simply because he dared to speak his true thoughts. We remember the charming smile, the flawless perfect appearance, the image of the elegant gentleman stepping out of a white limousine in Pretty Woman, and the man who turned cinema into a pure romantic dream for an entire generation. What we do not see is the belief behind that perfect exterior, an awakening carried from the refugee camps. Throughout the most brilliant years of his career, he kept two parallel worlds without anyone noticing the collision that was forming. The man who was twice voted the sexiest man alive, who once stood amid the brightest lights on the Oscar stage as the most valuable star of his generation, would later be quietly erased from the casting lists of every major studio, denied funding, and deliberately forgotten for 20 years, not because of scandal, not because of addiction, but because of the 30 seconds when he refused to read the script and chose to speak his true thoughts. The perfect appearance never told the whole story. Outside of cinema, the world proved far less forgiving than the characters he once portrayed on screen. Today, behind the most elegant gentleman in Hollywood, lies a haunting question. How could he find peace after 30 years of the system deciding to punish him solely for the moment he refused to stay silent? Before we look beyond the glory to find the real person behind the legend, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like for Richard Gere. To truly understand the man who dared to risk everything on the Oscar stage that night, we must return to the quiet countryside of upstate New York. Born on August 31, 1949, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Richard Tiffany Gere was the second of 5 children in a family where his father, Homer George Gere, sold insurance, and his mother, Doris Ann Tiffany, was a homemaker who kept the house tidy, a small house, a quiet garden, and a simple way of life. But the boy Richard possessed something that rural area could not contain, a multifaceted talent so extraordinary it seemed to blaze in whatever he touched, excellence in gymnastics that earned him a scholarship to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, piano and trumpet, played with a sensitivity far beyond his years, and an intellect sharp enough to choose philosophy as his major. Yet in 1969, after 2 years studying philosophy and drama, he did what most people could not understand. He dropped out of everything, abandoned the scholarship, abandoned the degree, abandoned the safe path that any middle-class family dreamed of for their child, to step into the world of acting. In the early 1970s, he performed Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead on small stages. He performed with the Provincetown Players and the Seattle Repertory Theater. He played trumpet professionally in a musician's commune in Vermont. From the beginning, Gere was someone ready to abandon certainty to follow an inner calling, and that pattern would repeat throughout his life. In the late 1970s, when his career was just beginning to flicker, with a supporting role in Looking for Mr. Goodbar in 1977 alongside Diane Keaton, and his first leading role in Days of Heaven in 1978, under director Terrence Malick, Gere took a quiet moment after the Cannes Film Festival to travel to India and Nepal. He had followed Zen Buddhism since his early 20s and had practiced meditation regularly for many years. But what happened on the outskirts of Pokhara, Nepal, was something no meditation book could have prepared him for. A Tibetan refugee camp, the faces of exile, the heavy silence of people who had lost their homeland, and without any warning, Richard Gere's life split in two. He described that as the real world, the world where pain was not written into a script and injustice had no happy ending. The true awakening seeped in day by day. In 1981, he went to Dharamsala in northern India and met the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, for the first time, a meeting he has repeatedly described as having changed everything. And that teacher-student relationship would become the moral compass for more than 40 years of his life thereafter, more enduring than any marriage, deeper than any role, and more costly than any career decision he ever made. Gere became a Tibetan Buddhist of the Gelugpa school, and in the silence of meditation he found what the stage and cinema had never given him, a purpose greater than himself, greater even than Hollywood, something he would never let go of no matter what the price. He did not yet know that what brought him the deepest peace would also be what exacted the highest cost. In 1987, together with scholar Robert Thurman and artist Philip Glass, he co-founded Tibet House US in New York, the first nonprofit organization whose mission was to preserve and promote Tibetan culture on American soil. At that time he was 38, his career was rising, and Hollywood viewed his Tibetan activities as a harmless hobby. They did not understand that this was not a pastime. This was his reason for living. In the early 1980s, Hollywood was craving an entirely new kind of leading man, not the bulging muscles of Sylvester Stallone, not the cold masculine toughness of Clint Eastwood, but something more refined, more seductive, more dangerous in its very elegance, and Richard Gere stepped precisely into that void. In 1980, Paul Schrader's American Gigolo cast him as Julian Kay, an upscale male escort in Los Angeles, living among perfectly tailored Armani suits and emotionless affairs, a role that demanded a rare combination of breathtakingly seductive appearance and enough acting depth to leave audiences both drawn in and unsettled. The film did not merely give him a successful role, it birthed an entirely new cultural icon, turning Richard Gere into a sex symbol and a tops star at the same time, establishing a type of urban, elegant, mysterious man who could invite you to dinner at the city's finest restaurant and make you feel unsafe with just a glance. 2 years later, An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982 lifted him to an entirely different level. The role of naval officer Zach Mayo brought him his first Golden Globe nomination, and the moment he appeared in his white uniform, walked into the factory, and swept Deborah Winger up in his arms amid the applause and tears of the workers, became one of the most iconic romantic scenes in all of American film history. The moment that clearly defined for the public that this was no longer a promising star but a genuine leading man of his generation. The Cotton Club in 1984 under Francis Ford Coppola and Internal Affairs in 1990 continued to prove that Gere possessed not only a perfect face but real acting depth, the ability to transform effortlessly between complex villains and classic romantic characters that very few of his contemporaries could match, even though Hollywoods still loved him primarily for his looks and elegance, rather than the genuine talent hidden beneath. But the true global turning point came in 1990, when Gary Marshall's Pretty Woman cast him as Edward Lewis, the elegant millionaire who falls for the streetwalker played by Julia Roberts, and that film changed the entire trajectory of his life in a way no one could have predicted. Pretty Woman grossed more than $460 million worldwide, turned Julia Roberts into an international superstar, but more importantly, it transformed Richard Gere from a major Hollywood star into a global icon, the embodiment of the perfect gentleman in the minds of millions of women around the world, the man stepping out of a white limousine with a bouquet of red roses that every romantic story dreamed of being written about. A second Golden Globe nomination followed immediately, and the world was no longer merely watching a talented actor. They were witnessing the undeniable presence of a man whose combination of lethal charm and unpredictable depth had completely redefined the modern leading man. In 1993, People magazine officially named him and Cindy Crawford the sexiest couple alive, and 6 years later, in 1999, he alone received the title of Sexiest Man Alive, becoming one of only 4 men in history to receive the honor twice, standing alongside Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Johnny Depp. Somersby in 1993 with Jodie Foster, Primal Fear in 1996 where he faced off against Edward Norton in a tense courtroom, and Runaway Bride in 1999 where he reunited with Julia Roberts. Each film added another brick to the already sky-high tower of his career, and at the very center of that tower was Cindy Crawford. They met in the summer of 1988 at a barbecue hosted by legendary photographer Herb Ritts. He was 38 at the peak of fame. She was 22, beginning to conquer the fashion world, and the attraction between them was so intense that they quickly moved in together in New York, meditating together, traveling to India and Nepal together, sharing Buddhist beliefs in a harmony that at the time seemed perfect and unbreakable. In 1991, they married in a quick ceremony in Las Vegas, a small and romantic wedding, and Hollywood officially had the most perfect golden couple of the decade. The handsomest star married to the most beautiful supermodel, Two flawless faces standing side by side on every red carpet, as if the universe itself had arranged to create the absolute picture of human success. This was Richard Gere at the absolute peak of power, having achieved the rarest accomplishment in Hollywood. Maintaining two parallel worlds perfectly at the same time, the world of stage lights and the world of spiritual awakening and commitment to Tibet within, both seeming to blend without conflict, as if one man could be both the most perfect romantic icon of Hollywood and a sincere Buddhist fighting for human rights without having to pay any price. But that perfection was only surface. On the night of March 29, 1993, at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, the 65th Academy Awards were unfolding before hundreds of millions of television viewers worldwide. And Richard Gere was invited to step onto the stage to present the award for Best Art Direction for the film Howard's End. He was at the absolute peak of everything a man could possess. Pretty Woman was still creating a global effect. Cindy Crawford was waiting for him in the audience. The title of Sexiest Man Alive belonged to him. And on the teleprompter in front of him was a task so simple that anyone could complete it. Open the envelope, read the winner's name, smile, step down. 30 seconds. Done. Gere walked onto the stage with his familiar smile. A perfect black tuxedo without a single wrinkle. The bright lights reflecting on his signature prematurely silver hair. And for the first few seconds, everything looked exactly like hundreds of other award presentations in Oscar history. Then he did not look at the teleprompter. Instead of reading the prepared script lines, he looked straight into the camera, straight into the eyes of hundreds of millions of people watching, and he began to speak about something that no one in that room wanted to hear. He wondered whether Deng Xiaoping was watching this ceremony with his children and grandchildren. He spoke about the human rights situation he called terrible that was occurring in China and Tibet, and he called on everyone to send love and truth to the people suffering in a place that most of the audience in the auditorium could not even point to on a map. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion Auditorium fell into silence, but this was not the silence of admiration, not the silence of an audience conquered by a great moment. This was the silence of pure shock, the silence of thousands of people simultaneously realizing that a top star had just broken the most sacred unwritten rule of Hollywood right on its most sacred stage. The show's director hurriedly signaled to cut the camera. The backstage fell into a state of controlled panic, and on the red velvet seats the most famous faces in the world sat motionless with expressions oscillating between surprise, discomfort, and an admiration they dared not show. The man standing on that stage, in the most expensive tuxedo, under the brightest lights, with the sexiest title, with the most beautiful supermodel waiting for him below, with a career at the highest peak any actor could dream of, that man in the space of 30 seconds chose to trade every single one of the things he had for a statement that no one in that room wanted to hear. He was not drunk, he was not out of control, he was not put up to it by anyone. This was a decision made in a few seconds, but that had been incubating for 12 years since the day he first sat before the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, and he knew exactly the price that would have to be paid. He simply decided that the truth was worth more. The consequences did not arrive like a tsunami, but like a tide, slowly, silently, and irreversibly. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences never publicly issued any ban. No official document was signed, no statement was released, but Richard Gere would never again be invited to present an award at the Oscars for the next 20 years, a punishment carried out entirely through silence. Film producers began looking at him differently, not because they disagreed with what he said, but because China was opening its film market, billions of dollars in revenue were forming on the other side of the Pacific, and Richard Gere had just made himself the most dangerous man in any negotiation involving Chinese money. Years later, when asked about that night, Gere replied with astonishing calm that he did not regard it as personal. He did not think anyone was the villain in that situation. He did what he needed to do, and they reacted the way they needed to react, an answer deeply marked by the man who had spent decades practicing meditation, but also an answer that made listeners wonder whether that calm was true strength or the final armor concealing a wound that even Buddhism could not completely heal. The price he paid never came in the form of a public verdict or an official ban. It came in the form of silence, in the form of phone calls that were never made, scripts that were never sent, casting meetings where his name was quietly crossed off the list beforehand. And that organized silence could kill a career more effectively, more thoroughly, and more ruthlessly than any scandal or controversy. In 1997, 4 years after the fateful Oscar night, Richard Gere starred in Red Corner, directed by John Avnet, a film about an American businessman trapped in the Chinese justice system where innocence has no value without the party's permission. And the film was a direct, unvarnished, undiplomatic condemnation of the entire power mechanism of Beijing. If the speech at the 1993 Oscars was the first time Richard Gere chose to confront China publicly, then Red Corner was the second time he made the same choice, in the same direction, at a far greater cost, and this time Hollywood finally understood a truth it had deliberately ignored for the previous 4 years, that Richard Gere would never stop, he would never apologize. He would never issue a carefully worded press statement to soothe relations with Beijing, and he would never quietly withdraw from Tibetan activism in exchange for the return of billion-dollar roles. From the moment Red Corner was released, the Chinese government officially banned Richard Gere from entering the country permanently, but the truly lethal ban did not come from Beijing. It came from Los Angeles itself. No official document was issued by any major Hollywood studio declaring that Richard Gere was banned from acting. No meeting was recorded in minutes. No decision was published in Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. But when the Chinese film market began to swell into a multi-billion-dollar revenue source that every studio coveted, Richard Gere discovered that he was being erased from the system silently and systematically in a terrifying way. Studios automatically removed his name from casting lists for any project that might be released in China. Independent producers who wanted to work with him found that no investor dared put money into a film with Richard Gere's name on the poster. And Gere himself later admitted to The Hollywood Reporter that someone had told him straight out that they could not finance a film with him because it would upset the Chinese side. But the moment that most clearly exposed the terrifying power of that invisible erasure mechanism came from a story Gere told with the calm of someone accustomed to being betrayed. He had been preparing to star in a film with a Chinese director. Everything was ready. The script was finished, the shooting schedule confirmed. And just 2 weeks before the start of filming, that director called him on a secure phone line and said in a voice full of fear that he could not continue, that if he collaborated with Richard Gere, he and his family would never be allowed to leave China again. And the project was canceled in absolute silence without a single newspaper reporting it. Nothing in Richard Gere's entire Hollywood career had prepared him for a world where a foreign government thousands of miles away could decide who was and was not allowed to act right on American soil, where talent, fame, and a history of contributions to the film industry carried no value compared to box office revenue in Shanghai and Beijing. Gere was not banned. He was made to disappear, and that silent, unexplained absence was more frightening than any public punishment because it left no evidence, created no official victim, and gave him nothing to fight against. Then in 2002, Chicago appeared and brought something that looked like hope but ultimately became the deepest wound in his entire career. Rob Marshall's musical film adaptation cast Gere as lawyer Billy Flynn, a role that required him to sing, dance, and act with the confidence and grace of someone born on a Broadway stage, and he completed it so brilliantly that the Hollywood Foreign Press Association awarded him the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Musical or Comedy, undeniable proof that his talent had not diminished by even 1% after 10 years of being pushed to the margins. Chicago won 6 Oscars at the 2003 ceremony, including Best Picture, and Gere's co-stars Catherine Zeta-Jones, Queen Latifah, Renee Zellweger, and John C. Reilly each received Academy nominations one after another. But the man who had been talented enough to win a Golden Globe for the lead role in a Best Picture Oscar winner stood completely alone on the morning the nominations were announced, watching each of his colleagues honored while his own name was conspicuously, deliberately, and painfully absent from the list, a snub so painful that years later he admitted it was the only snub in his entire career that truly hurt him. The 1993 Oscars were where he spoke the truth, The 2003 Oscars were where he was punished for having spoken. The same ceremony, the same building, the same man, two completely opposite outcomes, both for the same reason. The years after Chicago were the years Richard Gere gradually moved into the world of independent films with modest budgets and limited attention. Shall We Dance? In 2004 with Jennifer Lopez, B Season in 2005, The Hoax in 2006, Nights in Rodanthe in 2008 with Diane Lane, Hachi, A Dog's Tale in 2009, Arbitrage in 2012, where he received another Golden Globe nomination, and Norman in 2016. Each film showed an actor still working, still performing with undiminished subtlety and depth, but none of them was a blockbuster, none carried $100 million budget. None returned him to the A-list position he had once held. And that difference was not because he had lost his talent, but because he was no longer allowed to use that talent on the largest stage. Outside of those small films screened in empty theaters and film festivals followed only by critics, Richard Gere was no longer the sexiest man alive or Hollywood's most valuable leading man. He was simply a man quietly living with the 2-decade-long consequences of 30 seconds of honesty. But the price of that choice did not stop at the set and the box office. It seeped deeper, into the most intimate relationships, into the marriages he hoped would last forever, and into the private life he had always tried to protect from the lights he both loved and feared. When he met Cindy Crawford at photographer Herb Ritz's barbecue in the summer of 1988, he was 38 at his peak and she was 22, conquering the fashion world. The attraction between them was so intense that they quickly moved in together in New York, meditating together, traveling to India and Nepal together, and when they married in a quick ceremony in Las Vegas in 1991, Hollywood officially had the most perfect golden couple of the decade. But the 17-year age gap that at first was only a romantic detail gradually became an unhealable crack. Crawford later admitted that because he was so much older, she left the fashion world to enter his social circle, while Gere sank ever deeper into Buddhism and meditation. Two people moving at the speed of light, but on trajectories growing ever farther apart. And she told Porter magazine with regret that they thought flying from Paris to Los Angeles in one night was enough, but it was not. Tabloids constantly gossiped about Gere's sexuality, forcing the couple to issue an unprecedented joint statement in the Times in 1994, affirming that they were heterosexual and faithful, but that statement backfired disastrously and only fueled more speculation. Crawford said Gere was not afraid of the rumors, but could not bear people thinking he lived a lie because he needed credibility for his Tibetan activism. And there was a particularly deep cruelty in the fact that the man who spent his life defending the human rights of strangers on the other side of the world could not protect his own marriage from fabricated stories sold for a few dollars on supermarket shelves. They divorced in 1995. Crawford said it was not painful because they had never really merged their lives. But Gere, in an interview with Charlie Rose in 1996, admitted the divorce still hurt, and 20 years later on Mark Maron's WTF podcast in 2016, Crawford confessed that Gere felt like a stranger, 2 decades with no contact at all. Gere met Carrie Lowell, the Bond girl in License to Kill in 1989, and a star of Law and Order in the mid-1990s. They dated for 7 years before marrying in November 2002, and on February 6, 2000, they welcomed their son Homer James Jigme Gere, the child named Homer after his paternal grandfather, James after his maternal grandfather, and Jigme, Tibetan for fearless, because even in the most private moment of naming his firstborn Gere, still inscribed the mark of the choice that had shaped his entire life. But the 11-year marriage ended in September 2013, with the same familiar, painful pattern. Gere preferred quiet and meditation at the house in Bedford, New York. Lowell preferred the social life in North Haven next to Jimmy Buffett's house, and Page 6 summarized the marriage in one cruel sentence. He likes meditation, she likes parties. 2 failed marriages for the same reason were not a coincidence, but evidence that Gere lived too deeply in his inner world for anyone to truly be with him without feeling lonely. Right in the middle of the marriage, custody of Homer was settled quickly, but the property battle dragged on for 4 years around the $120 million estate. Lowell felt she had sacrificed her career for the family, and during one court appearance at Manhattan Supreme Court, Gere angrily jabbed his umbrella at a press photographer, a rare moment when the calm armor cracked just enough to show that he too hurt. He too was angry. He too was a human being torn apart by things that meditation could not heal. The divorce was finalized in 2016, with Lowell receiving about $33 million. And there was the gerbil rumor, a completely fabricated urban legend that had clung to Gere since the mid-1980s, starting from a forged ASPCA fax that an anonymous sender circulated throughout Hollywood after Pretty Woman. Gere believed Sylvester Stallone started it, but Stallone denied it. Snopes.com and National Enquirer journalist Mike Walker both confirmed it was entirely fabricated with no evidence whatsoever. Yet 40 years later, the rumor still lived, still mentioned on Conan O'Brien's podcast in 2023, and a man who devoted his entire life to human rights and meditation and charity was most remembered by many for a dirty story that no credible source had ever confirmed. Gere almost never commented publicly, and his silence was both admirable in its restraint and sad in its loneliness. Then in March 2007, at an HIV awareness event in New Delhi, Gere hugged and kissed Bollywood actress Shilpa Shetty on the cheek multiple times on stage to demonstrate that a kiss does not transmit HIV. But that act, born entirely of compassion, immediately exploded into an international scandal when extreme Hindu groups burned effigies of both of them in the streets, and a court issued an arrest warrant on charges of public obscenity. Gere apologized. India's Supreme Court dismissed the warrant and called the case cheap publicity, but Shetty had to fight the charges for 15 years until January 2022, when they were finally completely cleared. He came to India out of compassion and left with an arrest warrant, the same pattern that had repeated throughout his life, choosing to act for good and being punished for that very act. But while titles can nail a legacy into the history books, the quiet, continuous work of being present for family demands an entirely different kind of dedication and strength. In 2014, while the divorce battle with Carrie Lowell was still ongoing, Richard Gere went to stay at a small hotel perched on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean in Positano, on the Amalfi Coast, a hotel owned by the family of Alejandra Silva Garcia Baquero, a 35-year-old Spanish political and media activist who was also in the process of divorcing her former husband Gavin Friedland, a mining industry businessman. A mutual friend introduced them, and Alejandra later told Hola magazine that they looked at each other and felt an intense, inexplicable connection, could not take their eyes off each other the entire night, and from that moment they were never apart again. The 33-year age gap between them was more than double the gap that had once existed between Gere and Crawford. But this time there was something completely different from every previous relationship. Alejandra did not merely accept Gere's spiritual world as a hobby to be respected. She truly shared it, truly understood it, truly lived in it with him in a way that neither Crawford nor Lowell had ever managed. They married quietly in April 2018 at Gere's ranch in Pound Ridge, New York. No red carpet, no paparazzi, no Las Vegas, no magazine announcement. Only the quiet of two people who had found each other after both had been twisted enough by life to know that that quiet was worth more than every flashbulb. And then came the gentlest moment in the entire story of Richard Gere's life. When Alejandra became pregnant with their first child at the end of 2018, they went together to meet the Dalai Lama, the spiritual teacher Gere had followed for 37 years since their first meeting in Dharamsala. And the Dalai Lama placed his hand on Alejandra's pregnant belly to bless the unborn child. Alejandra shared that moment on Instagram with the caption that they could not speak of it before telling the Dalai Lama. And there was a contrast so profound it was breathtaking in the fact that one government banned him permanently from the most populous nation on earth, while the spiritual leader he had followed his entire life placed a hand on his wife's belly to bless the next generation. The same man, two completely opposite worlds, one closing every door, one opening new life. Alexander was born in February 2019. Only 14 months later, in April 2020, James was born. Richard Gere became a father for the second and third times at ages 69 and 70, while also becoming stepfather to Albert Friedland, Alejandra's son from her previous marriage, born in 2012. The family moved to Madrid, Spain. Gere left America for the woman he loved, and he told El España in January 2025 with astonishing simplicity that she was happy at home, and if she was happy, then he was happy. The life of the man who once owned Hollywood was now so simple it was hard to believe. The whole family went to bed at 9:30 p.m. He read fairy tales to the children before sleep. He did not cook. He rarely watched new films, because with 3 small children, ages 11, 5, and 4, there was no longer time for the cinema. And Alejandra said with her own surprise that Richard was a devoted and always present father. It sounded idealized, but it was true. He really sat there every night reading stories to the children. But time is a ruthless and undefeated opponent that spares no one, and in February 2023, when the whole family vacationed in Nuevo Vallarta, Mexico, to celebrate Alejandra's 40th birthday, 73-year-old Richard Gere had to be hospitalized with pneumonia after weeks of persistent coughing. Son James also had pneumonia, Alejandra and Alexander had sinusitis and ear infections. The whole family was sick for nearly 3 weeks, and although he was discharged after one night with antibiotics, that moment was a cold reminder that at age 76 health was no longer something that could be taken for granted. Then in 2024, after more than 2 decades of being pushed to the margins of Hollywood, the comeback came from the least expected place, television, when Gere took the role of Bosco in The Agency, a Paramount Plus spy series produced by George Clooney and Grant Heslov, playing the CIA London station chief with a past as an undercover agent for 8 years, co-starring with Michael Fassbender and Jeffrey Wright in a cast that any blockbuster would covet. This was the first official television role in a career spanning more than 4 decades, and Gere explained that the quality of television today was no different from cinema. The same film actors, the same film directors, the same budgets, or even higher. And he had long admired the original French series Le Bureau de Légende. Season 2 premiered on June 21, 2026, the same year he appeared at the 2024 Cannes Film Festival, with Paul Schrader's O, Canada, alongside Uma Thurman and Jacob Elordi. And co-star Jodie Turner-Smith admitted to the press that she could not hide her admiration when standing next to him on set. Hollywood had sidelined him for 20 years, and he returned not because Hollywood forgave or because China loosened up, but because streaming television had created an entirely new playing field where the influence of the Chinese box office was weaker and pure talent was still valued correctly. He had successfully transformed from a star who once carried the expectations of all Hollywood into a man who simply wanted to enjoy the craft of acting in his own way, at his own pace, without needing the approval of any system. In 2025, the organization Human Rights First awarded him the inaugural Visionary Award, honoring a lifetime of dedication to human rights. And that same year, at the International Tibetan Youth Forum in McLeodganj, India, he stood before hundreds of young Tibetan exiles and vowed that he would continue fighting for Tibetan freedom, even after the 14th Dalai Lama passed away. More than 40 continuous years, from the Pokhara refugee camp in the late 1970s to the Oscar stage, in 1993 to Red Corner, in 1997 to the call to boycott the Beijing Olympics in 2008 to McLeodganj in 2025. The same man, the same choice, repeated dozens of times across 4 decades, each time with a price, each time he did not change his mind. The vibrant, dazzling rhythm of youth had been permanently replaced by a slower, far more deliberate rhythm that finally allowed him to look back and see the incredible distance he had traveled from the quiet countryside of upstate New York to the position of a global icon. Homer James Jigme Gere was born on February 6, 2000, in New York, the son of Richard Gere and Carrie Lowell, carrying the Tibetan name Jigme meaning fearless. And at age 26, the young man bearing that name was beginning to write the first chapter of his own story. After graduating from Brown University in 2024, Homer entered the world of acting not through his father's enormous chateau, but through small student films he made himself. And when Richard Gere watched those films, he realized that his son was truly good, truly possessed an innate acting instinct that no one could teach. And from there, one thing led to another until Homer appeared as Dylan Reed in the 3rd and final season of Euphoria on HBO in 2026, co-starring with Sydney Sweeney in a role that demanded a confidence and depth very few young actors possessed in their debut. Only a few months later, Homer took the role of Robert Mallory in The Shards, a series adapted from Bret Easton Ellis's novel developed by Ryan Murphy for FX and Hulu, playing a mysterious transfer student arriving at Buckley Prep School in Los Angeles in the early 1980s, his appearance coinciding with the wave of terror from the serial killer The Trawler. And he was currently filming White Lies under director Oliver Stone. 3 major projects in the same year with 3 of the industry's most important directors. That journey was not easy, and Homer had clearly stated that he wanted to build his own identity rather than be endlessly compared to the massive achievements attached to his father's name, a determination that Richard Gere not only respected but understood more deeply than anyone else in the world because he knew exactly what it felt like to live under the weight of expectations he had, not created. Gere told People magazine with undisguised pride that he was proud on 2 levels. First, the kid was really good. The kid had the instinct of knowing what he was doing on set. And second, the kid handled everything very well. The kid was a good guy who understood that this was not an easy job and not everyone could function inside it. Homer shared on Good Morning America that the biggest advice from his father was mainly about how to behave on set and how to make the work fit him. And Gere joked with the smile of a completely satisfied father that this was great because he would retire and the kid could support him. For Richard Gere, watching his son face the inevitable challenges and turning points of the acting profession brought an entirely different perspective on the very industry that had made him and had also nearly destroyed him. He knew the price, he knew the risks, he knew that Hollywood could take everything away simply because you dared to be yourself. But he also knew that the joy of acting, the pure joy of becoming someone else in front of the camera, was something no one could take away if you did not allow it. And then came the detail no one could have scripted. In The Shards, Homer Gere co-starred with Kaia Gerber, the daughter of Cindy Crawford and Randy Gerber. 30 years after their parents' divorce and 3 decades after Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford disappeared from each other's lives as if the most glamorous marriage of the 1990s had never happened, the next generation stood in the same frame on Ryan Murphy's set, and Crawford and Gere, 2 people who had maintained a frozen relationship for 3 decades, were forced to begin thawing because their children now shared the same professional world. Hollywood divided the parents, but Hollywood reunited the children. The names Gere and Crawford, that once appeared together on the covers of every major magazine in the world, then vanished from each other's lives, for 30 years were now together again on a movie poster. Through the next generation, and life was a circle that none of them could have predicted when they stood before the altar in Las Vegas in 1991. Richard Gere could not be accurately reduced to a simple, easily digestible story. Whether the image of a flawless moral hero, or a tragic victim of a ruthless system, or a faded star seeking late redemption, he was a man who had lived at the most absolute and dizzying extremes of the human experience. He had once stood in the middle of the Oscar stage, the most beautiful, the most confident, the most powerful any actor could dream of. And that same man was erased from that system for a long and exhausting 20 years. He had once been the perfect half of Hollywood's most dazzling golden couple, and that same man divorced twice for the same reason, because he lived too deeply in his inner world for anyone to truly reach him. He was permanently banned by the most populous government on earth, and that same man had the spiritual leader he followed his entire life place, a hand on his wife's belly to bless their unborn child. To remember only the noble sacrifice and unwavering stance would be to sanctify his story and make him less human. Conversely, to remember only the divorces, the dirty rumors, and the collapse of the A-list career would be a profound injustice to the legacy he built. He had done far more than simply act well and win awards. He had completely changed the question of what a movie star could and should do with their position. And what truly remained, what would endure far longer than the films and the controversies, was not the title of Sexiest Man Alive or the Golden Globes or any box office number, but the simple and extraordinary fact that at age 76 Richard Gere was still the same man who stood on the Oscar stage on the night of March 29, 1993, and refused to read the script, The world around him had changed. Hollywood had changed. China had changed. Television had changed. Even the way we consume cinema had changed. But he had not. He still meditated every morning, still supported Tibet every day, still met the Dalai Lama, still read stories to his sons every night, still spoke the truth when asked. And that very unchanging quality, that quiet and enduring steadfastness across 4 decades despite every price paid, was the most extraordinary thing about his life. His ultimate legacy did not lie in any trophy case or filmography. It lay in the question that his existence posed to every person who looked at his life. A question that did not ask about him. It asked about us. When you look back on the extraordinary journey of Richard Gere, what lingers is not the charming appearance, not the classic films, not the scandals and rumors, but the silent question you carry when you turn off this video. The last time you chose to speak the truth, even knowing you would lose something. When was it? The last time you refused to stay silent when the whole world wanted you to shut up, when was it? And if you cannot remember, then perhaps that is exactly why Richard Gere's story makes you feel something you cannot name. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and join us in honoring the man who chose to stand tall when the whole world wanted him to kneel. If this story made you think, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next stories about people who dared to live differently. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. See you in the next video.